Thank you very much for those kind words. Thank you for inviting me. And it's a pleasure to be able to speak without the shackles of being president of the European University, which is a certain liberty I enjoy now. There's one hard fact I think we should be respecting, the coffee at 11:30. So I will divide my remarks into four. First, I want to address the way the question was framed and to have some thoughts about that. And then I want to look at evidence-based research in four areas: private sector, the individual, government, and topic closest to my heart in the university world. And then say something about the future of universities and that topic. Now, framing it as let's skip universities, evidence-based research matter, there's a certain lament there. It seems as if it's under threat, and there's also a certain value judgment that this is a terrible trend we are going through, and this post-fact and post-truth society. And we heard from the previous speaker that those of us who believe in that have to defend a world of rationality, etc. I don't understand quite why this recent fascination with post-truth and post-fact. And I want to challenge it in a few ways. I think the phrase was coined by Stefan Zweig in his autobiography, The World of Yesterday, which was published in 1942, the day before he finished it, the day before he and his wife committed suicide. And he there spoke about, in a romantic way, about the world he lived in, and now we live in a post-truth society. So I thought it wasn't his best book, although his life, of course, is very interesting. And so there, in and of itself, we see that somebody is lamenting in that period about moving into a post-truth society, and now there's a suddenly revival of this concept. And I don't think there has been much change. I think the sort of role of facts and how one plays with facts is a kind of constant. It's a constant of the human condition. The fact that there's Twitter and website and Facebook and fake news outlets doesn't mean that we are less factual than we were before, when our news was dominated by a few organizations which had a monopoly over dissemination of news, and I don't see any evidence that they got it any more right or any less right than we get it today. They are the ones that fed us with the truth of weapons of mass destructions, and one can go on and on. I think the volatility that facts play in our lives as individual and in public life is a constant, and we know more post-factual or post-truth today than we were 20 years ago or 40 years ago or 60 years ago. What Stefan Zweig didn't like was the political and cultural turn that Europe was turning to with the rise of National Socialism. But there was no obscuring of the fact. Hitler was quite explicit about what his program was, what he wanted to do, and people embraced it willingly. There was not a factual mistake in the embrace of the fascist regimes in Italy or in Germany. It was not a factual error that they were making. It was a value error they were making, but they did it willingly. And there's something disturbing, something self-serving, which again was very much in evidence in the panel before me, because it's a kind of Marxist false consciousness. The reason they are not deciding the way I am or I'm decided, it's because they really don't get it. They don't understand. If only we explained it to them better, then they would understand. So I am the custodian of rationality and factual accuracy, and which is both a little bit paternalistic and patronizing. I remember even a president of the Commission, when the European Constitution was rejected, the immediate react, we didn't explain it well enough. No, you explained it well enough, and those people who voted against it didn't want what you explained. The comment we heard about, well, it's not quite post-factual because, look, 48% in Britain voted to remain. As if the 52 who voted to exit, make no mistake, had I had the vote, I would have voted to remain. But as if the 52% who voted against were motivated by a wrong factual basis. If only they had their facts right, they would have voted to remain. And the fact is that I don't think that either side was closer to the truth than the other. There was a kind of photo finish who was misleading in their factual presentation between the Remain and the Brexiters. But it wasn't the facts, it was other dimensions of our wishes and desires and self-understanding, both individual and social, which drove most of the Brexit, rather than a calculus of based on a factual understanding. And if we want to talk about irrationality, there's an irrationality of the think tanks, as we heard it, who, indeed, as we heard it, it's economic rationality, and it's irrational to imagine that the human condition is driven by a calculus of economic benefits, and they're not whole other regions and territories of the human condition which make choices not necessarily based on economic betterment and economic rationality, and it's irrational in designing policy not to take account, for good or for bad, that that is part of the human condition. So the irrationality of the premise of Homo economicus is just as great as the irrationality of people who say, facts notwithstanding, this is what I want to do because it corresponds to other wishes and other desires. So that's on the kind of, it's not that I don't think that facts matter, but I think they don't matter less today, or that our mistakes or outcomes we don't like are because of factual post-truth or post-factual. I think there are other things that drive it, and at our peril we disregard it. Not on bread alone does man liveth, but of course religion is not factual, so that also has to be dismissed. It's a very secularist worldview that was on display and that informs the way the sort of lament was put here. So I also want to say another thing, that and I will get to that in a minute, that when it comes to the world of university, I think I'm being factual under the stern eyes of some of the professors sitting here, some of them my colleagues, to say that it's fact-based, empirical base, merges into quantitative-based, deliverable-based, and the whole universe of funding for university research. And if I am right in that this kind of evidence-based research as the yardstick of valuable research is what is at the basis of this question, then in a deep sense, which I will argue in a minute, it's a threat to the university. It's a threat to the university in a whole variety of ways, and not just the usual thing, well, what about philosophy, or what about literature, or what about theology? But even in the hard sciences, when Albert Einstein revolutionized physics by his theory of relativity, it was not an evidence-based piece of work. In fact, with the means of measurement at that time, it was contra-evidence-based work. It was entirely conceptual, a triumph of the imagination and not of evidence-based research. Hence, it was rejected. Hence, he had such a difficult career. And he really came into his own, and that is just one of those ironies of history. The evidence-based research which proved the validity of the theory of relativity was the dropping of atom bombs, which killed hundreds of thousands of people in three or 4 minutes. So complex world, this fact-based research and the lament, but more of this below. So that's end of Act 1. So now, where does evidence-based research matter? And I want to give 4 areas and 4 examples, again, to show that it's a messy game and that therefore we have to treat it, the main thing is to treat it with good measure and understanding. So I start with the private sector, and there it would seem that evidence-based research should be the least problematic, because the evidence is required. There, more than anywhere else, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Investment decisions that have to produce profit. And that's the evidence that the private sector looks for. If it doesn't produce profit, it's wrong. If it produces profit, it's right. So it seems to be that that is the world where the evidence-based research will be most celebrated. But I gather that already yesterday in the discussions, and there were interesting matices of this in today's discussion, the evidence-based research often militates against the act of imagination, even in the world of business and innovation. If we look at the likes of Steve Jobs or Bill Gates and others like them, or the guy who started Amazon, this was not evidence-based research. This was an intuition, a breaking forms, doing things that people said would fail. The internet could never develop into a real platform of sale, etc. These were acts of imagination that were not evidence-based. And the evidence-based is also a twin brother, or at least a cousin, of risk aversion. And there's a cultural dimension here. And that's why, for example, venture funds in the United States are much more active and successful than venture funds in Europe, because there's a more willingness to venture out, not on evidence-based, but on intuition and imagination, rather than to say, either where's all the evidence that this will be successful, or else I want absolute security that if it fails, I will not lose money and therefore I will not lend it to you. So even in that world where it would seem that evidence-based research would seem to be most celebrated, it's a complicated story. And the story of Nokia is a company that was incredibly evidence-based and failed to, in a non-evidence-based way, to predict or imagine what a future could be like. For individuals, I've already said in my opening remarks what I have to say. If you read Dan Ariely, irrationality is hardwired into us. And we know more irrational today than we were yesterday or the day before yesterday or before. So one just has to accept as a fact the irrationality that is built into the human conditions. We do not fall in love rationally. We fall in love irrationally. And we take all kinds of decisions in irrational, even eventually harmful ways to ourselves. But we just have to accept as fact that that is so. But we also have to not accept as fact, but make a value judgment that the irrationality that we complain about, look, that is really an irrational decision which will harm you, but there are other aspects to irrationality. To jump into a river to save somebody that's drowning and risking your life with small chance that you will actually save them is an irrational act, but a very virtuous act. And the whole dimension of our life, and it's only one dimension, it's never, I don't know any saints, but of virtue, of generosity, we should not explain them in rational terms, in utilitarian terms. If you are generous to somebody, they will be generous to you, etc. There are dimensions to the way we live that are premised not on rationality, but are premised on other aspects of our minds and our souls and our conception what it is to live the good life. So it's true that in those areas where rational decision-making, how I will invest in my pension, I should not hide it under the mattress, we should argue for rationality. But what we should not accept is the takeover of rationality as the model of the human condition, and the model also for policymaking, not only because policymaking should understand people as they are and not as homo economicus, but because also in our policymaking there is space for considerations which are not utilitarian and not driven by market efficiency, and sometimes are even noble. The whole European construct, now under such pressure, is a noble idea, a creative act of faith, imagination in the human condition, which they used economic instruments to advance it. But it was not the purpose. The purpose was not an efficient common marketplace, but an ever closer union among the peoples of Europe, and the notion that we were not bringing coalescing states together, but bringing human beings together. That was an insight, an aspiration, a dream, an ideal that was not driven by the world of market efficiency and calculus. Market efficiency and calculus was one of the tools that was employed. So you see where I'm driving now in my second set of comments. I'm not an anti-factional, and I think I'm an incredibly rational person, but I would not allow those dimensions of our private and public life to colonize our whole existence to our detriment, even to the detriment of homo economicus, because if you're not perceiving the subject of your inquiry correctly, the results will be governments. So in governments, it's not just financial decisions, how to spend money, which should be rational, but also legislative. And there, of course, facts-based and scientific method are very important. Here's a striking example. So in the 80s, Giuliani transformed New York by introducing the broken window policy. Not saying, oh, we don't have time for all these daily life little crimes, we have to focus on murder and rape and robbery, but go after people who throw rubbish in the street or panhandling or just minor acts of vandalism. And the theory was that if you do that, you create a climate of legal observance and rule of law, and there will be a spillover into the big crimes so that it's a policy not wasted. And lo and behold, he introduced that policy, which came with quite a heavy price for individual liberty and respecting. It was not priceless. And crime in New York dropped by 60%. Shining example of fact, evidence-based research and policy making. Am I right or am I right? I'm wrong. Because when it was looked at more critically and more clinically, it turns out that Los Angeles, where the police was dysfunctional in exactly the same period where Giuliani rationalized policing, also crime dropped by 60%. So although there was a correlation, we got our facts right, but our scientific method wrong. Now, this is not to discredit. I'm using it as an opposite example. Governments should be fact-based in their legislative and spending agenda, but they should get it right. They should get it right. As an echo of what I said before, what angers us, what frustrates us, what in some way even a little bit terrifies me, is when suddenly I see somebody like Trump winning the elections, and who knows if in France, you see now I can say this, Marine Le Pen would win the election next year. It's not, the very fact that it's not an impossibility is a huge change from even 15 years ago. So all these things are worrying, or the very great disappointment because of the huge damage, mostly to the UK, but also deep damage to the EU by Brexit. But if I just dismiss it, this is a post-factual society, people didn't vote for Trump because of the lies he told them. No. People voted for Trump because he responded to certain yearnings, fears, anxieties, some of them base and some of them not base. But we cannot dismiss them and we cannot look down on those people. And I think Brexit is in the same. So government too, not only we academics or the think tanks, have to have an awareness of the totality of the human condition and not impute the rational decision-making which should inform their own decision-making to the way peoples act and what motivates and drives people. So I get to the world of university. So at one level, we need more evidence-based, not research. I'm always impressed in my long life in the university world and raising millions and millions of euros in different contexts, how exigent the funders are when it comes to your proposal to convince them, we call it the pitch, to convince them to give the money, and how negligent they are when it comes to the results. You send them the 20 books, you've achieved the objects of the research project. Of course, they never bother to read the books. They never bother to say, is it a valuable book? Was it worth the money, etc.? So there's definitely room to rethink the way we distribute money to the research in terms of the results. So there I have some kind of sympathy, but I want to explain the dark side of the moon, because the evidence-based research, which, as I said before, maybe wrongly, but I think I'm on pretty solid ground, which is part of a worldview which is evidence-based, empirical-based, deliverables, will it produce jobs, what is its significance? It comes with great dangers. So first, it tends to diminish those disciplines of the academy which are not empirical, which are not evidence-based. And we are, in the universities, custodians of a civilization. And the enduring part of that civilization is typically not evidence-based. Aristotle was not an evidence-based person. He actually claimed that women had 32 teeth and men 36. All he had to do was ask his wife to open her mouth and count. But we still read Aristotle, not because of the evidence-based, but because of the depth of thought. And the enduring legacy of our civilization is to be found at least as much as anywhere else in the arts and in literature and in music, etc. And all those disciplines are under pressure. When a university wants to close a department to save money, the first to go are the humanities. But they're also under pressure because students don't want to enroll in them, not only because will there be jobs or will there not be jobs. We actually have a dearth of teachers in many areas. But because the message we get is that the only thing that counts is the kind of pursuit that can be translated into the rewards of homo economicus. So we in the university have a duty to remain as custodians of a civilization and to realize that there are many disciplines that in and of themselves are not evidence-based, but works of the mind. So literature, studying great works of art, is not a banal or useless pursuit because it doesn't translate into the kind of deliverable that is now appreciated. The second thing is, and again, my colleagues from the world of university might say that I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. It's brought about a great pressure on the value of teaching. because the thing that counts is research and evidence-based research and deliverable, and if universities are to get money from outside sources, it will always be research generated. What is the research project, etc. You don't get more money to improve the quality of your teachers, and you don't reward your professors because they are great teachers. Now, one thing I will not tolerate when people will say, but you can't be a great teacher if you're not a great scholar. Because there are different ways of scholarship. I have colleagues, and I was taught by teachers, who published very few things in their life, although marvelous things. But they were incredible scholars. They had read and thought deeply about everything. And they were wonderful teachers dedicated to the world of teaching, which is a huge function of the university. But make no mistake, the research pressure is taking a toll on the teaching commitment of our universities. And MOOCs are not the answer. MOOCs are the answer because, there's a kind of good calculus of input and reaching hundreds and thousands of people. The United States experience is that many universities are closing down their distance learning because of the low quality of distance learning. So it's popularized, but it's low quality. And it's very often misleading. People enroll, pay money, and end up with very low quality academic learning. There are exceptions to the rule, but I think there are exceptions. I need to end, so I want to end on one subject that is close to my heart and was in a very real way close to my heart in the 3 years where I was president of the European University Institute, is how we train those who train the researchers, which is how we train university professors. And here there's a universal paradox, not to say scandal. This is across the globe. You send your kids to kindergarten, you would never send them to a kindergarten if the kindergarten teacher did not have a certificate that they trained to be a kindergarten teacher. And that is true also for elementary school and true for high school. In university, especially in Europe, the requirement for teaching is to get a doctorate. But I want to say two things about the doctoral programs in Europe. It's a generalization, but it's a generalization that has much more than simply a kernel of truth. Doctoral programs in Europe, now a caricature, is hello Mr. X or hello Mrs. Y. This is your professor who will be your supervisor for the next 3 or 4 years when you do your doctorate. Arrivederci. That's it. It's dissertation-centric and supervisor-supervisee-centric to the nth degree. Now, there are two problems with this. One is, in the way we conceive our doctorates in Europe, in the social sciences and humanities, it's a great specialization. It's a focus on the subject of research, but our programs are very, very scarce when it comes to broad academic literacy. So even within one discipline, my discipline is law, if one is doing state aids, so for 3 or 4 years he or she will be focusing on state aids, and it's not that they will not read outside the legal discipline, they will not even read outside the discipline on which there is the subject of their research. And I think that's undesirable if we think of them not only as researcher specialists, but as teachers and tutors of the next generation of students who will not be professors, but should go out into life not only prepared for the marketplace, but prepared for informed citizenship. And if all you do in the doctorate and all your training to be a university professor is this narrow kind of specialization, you're not going to do that so well. And the second thing is, which is a kind of paradox heaped on paradox, so it's not only that in the course of doctoral studies in most places there are exceptions. The European University Institute is a shining exception. Some universities in Denmark are exceptions. We don't teach our doctoral students how to be a university teacher. Everybody in this room went to university, and you all remember that you had some fabulous scholars who were terrible teachers. Now, being trained to be a teacher, if you are not naturally gifted, will not make you a star teacher, but will certainly improve. In fact, the star teachers are the ones who probably don't need so much training. But we don't do that as part of our doctorates. And secondly, the people who train the doctorates, the supervisors, they get no training in how to supervise a doctorate. In only few places in Europe, there's a certification requirement to be a supervisor. Kindergarten, yes, but supervisor of a doctoral student, no. It's untenable. I said we have a meeting with Factual Reality at 11:30. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Professor. Let me just say a few words, because I think we are running out of time. I mean, first of all, I think you heard the voice of reason and of common sense based on experience. I liked what you said about calling into question some of the things which are being said about a post-factual world or evidence-based. Some of the stuff I heard yesterday reminded me of what Keynes said about words. He said, words ought to be a little wild, for they are the assault on thoughts of the unthinking. And so it's very good, and I listened to Nick Gowing, for instance, with great enthusiasm. But I think it's also good to question some of the things, because we are a bit in the danger now of falling into the trap of creating a new politically correct slogan, which is a post-factual world. This being said, Professor, we do have certain problems, though, I think, and you wouldn't deny that. Thank you very much for what you said about the EU. You said in one sentence something very important, which many people have forgotten and which the successive governments in Britain have always managed to dissimulate. The European Union project has always been a political project. Now, I will be very short. I will say 2 or 3 things on something which struck me, where I would put maybe a little nuance on what you said, and then I will ask one simple question. You talked about acts of imagination which are necessary. You talked about humanistic studies, humanities and things like that, in order to say everything cannot be evidence-based. I would slightly, I basically agree with that, obviously, but I would slightly take issue with it in the sense that even imagination or even humanistic studies have to be rooted in some kinds of evidence and reality, because otherwise you're just creating empty concepts. So in that sense, I think I would be slightly more nuanced. And as to the Trump election, I do not know. I'm not an American. You say it was not based on the facts or lies. What I do know is that Brexit was, to quite an extent, based on lies, in my view. For instance, lies about migration. The simple fact that there was a confusion which was entertained right from the start between migration and free movement of people. There were clear lies about financing and money, and I do not say that was the main reason, but of course it certainly didn't contribute. Now, I have one question to you, which concerns more directly the universities. Since it is clear we do have a problem, and if you listen to many speakers the last hours, there is a certain problem with facts being invented by words and words replacing facts and all of that. I was just wondering whether universities are not themselves, to some extent, responsible for what's going on in 2 ways. One is, of course, by, in some places, teaching spinning, communication they call it, and more importantly, something else, and that is I mentioned this yesterday in a brief intervention, this political correctness which has been imposed from the universities. You don't call a spade anymore, and for me that is
That's politically incorrect, as you know.
Yes, I know, exactly. I like politically incorrect. I think we should call a spade because you stifle debate otherwise. So that was my question to you. And maybe you can briefly respond, and then we'll go to the audience.
I should be careful not to be too defensive. But of course, the nature of the beast is when you have to speak for 20 minutes and you end up speaking for 25 minutes. We always do that also. We have to drive 50 kilometers an hour, we drive 60. So I was not nuanced. I was deliberately not nuanced because I was trying to drive home some counterweight to this comforting idea it's a counterfactual world and a post-truth world, which is always premised, but I've got the facts right and I know the truth, but unfortunately, the world. So I was just trying to resist that, and I was, as you said, not nuanced, so your comment is well taken in that respect. You know, you can't talk with a Europeanist and mention the word Brexit and then expect him not to pounce on that red meat. So I recently wrote an editorial, Google it, and the title was There's Chutzpah and then there's Cameroon. You know, I said, you know the definition of chutzpah, if talking about truths and untruths, is chutzpah is the guy who kills his mother and his father and then goes before a judge and says, mercy, I'm an orphan.
A poor orphan, yes.
So, pardon? Reframing, yes. So there really was quite a measure of chutzpah. I mean, for example, when accession happened, there was an option to stage free movement of workers. Some respectable member states did that.
Most of them did. 7 years
Britain
transition.
says, no, we will just take them in.
True.
And then to a great benefit, both culturally and economically to Britain, 3 or 4 million migrants, European citizens, moved to Britain. And don't tell me it's not chutzpah, and then you say, oh my God, the barbarians are at the gate. Right. And I gave a series of examples where it was just beyond. So, but I don't think that it's really those facts which can explain the mood, not only of Brexit. So maybe the facts might have shifted the vote and then we wouldn't worry about it. But I don't think that explains the mood that we see, that explains Salvini and explains, we can go through every member state.
Yes. I agree.
And we should not go on and speaking about Orban. It's the huge majority of Hungarians who vote for Orban, more than once. And they are not driven simply if they knew the facts, they would do things differently. So at our peril, we are also a little bit self-deceiving because, for example, what did we in Europe take over from the Brexit debate? Surely not the lies. But the notion that the utility, that the way to measure Europe is what it gives. Are you better off or not worse? And even now in the post-Brexit thinking is what policies should we adopt which will prove to the citizens that we are better off? And
there is an awful term which is being used in this respect, which I don't like very much, but each time we prepare a summit, we say deliverables, as if we were sort of merchants sending a deliverable to the poor citizen. Yeah.
Of course, these things are important. They're important in democracy. But there's a very important, this popular word, narrative of Europe, which is not based on will I be better off or worse off, but is based on we are community of fate. For better or worse, what we do in Italy will have an impact in France. What we do in France will have an impact in Germany. If we look at our history, we are inextricably linked. So the only question is, can we manage it better or can we not manage it better? But there's not that line of discourse that is now even in those who are reacting. And part of it is, it's like digging one's own grave. If the whole case for Europe is made, you're better off. It's problematic.
Thank you very much. I think we'll now turn to the audience. We have a young talents network, as opposed, I suppose, to an old plodders network, which I am part of, and Klaus Weiler and those people. But we have a young talents network, and I think I saw Francesco wanting to ask a question first.
When does young end?
Well, certainly well below my age. Francesco, please.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you very much. What I would like, my question would be on the part of your speech at individual level. So you have said that choices can be done rational or on the basis of values. Now, my question would be how you see in the future science and evidence-based research to create critical minds for better choices. You have mentioned citizenship, but only when you were talking about doctors, so the role of university there. But I was wondering also at individual level. And then the second question would be exactly how facts and evidence-based research, how and if it can influence values. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then I'll take 2 or 3 more questions. I saw Giga there. I saw Heather at the end. Oh, there are many questions. So, and the lady here. And then we'll come back to the professor.
Giga Turk from University of Ljubljana, Slovenia. Professor Weiler, thank you so much for this lecture. It was most refreshing. And thank you particularly for pointing out that there is evidence that humans do not only act on evidence, but on intuitions and instincts, etc. And what we need to accept is that actually these intuitions are positive. They have been shaped in our history and they have generally survived because they have contributed to our well-being. But the question I have is, in fact, a problem about social scientific research. If Einstein does a theory, he is not changing how the universe works. If researchers in think tanks, in humanities, in social scientists, create a new theory, do research, they actually have an impact on what reality in society will be, and an additional responsibility because of that. Could you comment on this?
Thank you very much. Then we have Heather.
Graby from Open Society Institute. Thank you very much for this very helpful counterbalance to another source of conventional wisdom. There is a bit of a paradox here that, in fact, it's hard science. It's neuroscience working on the basis of, looking at the brain, doing scans, doing very classic scientific methodology, which has proven your point that, in fact, human beings don't think only rationally, that their decisions are, in fact, informed by many other things, intuition, as the previous questioner pointed out, but also emotion, that Descartes' error was to believe that somehow you can divide up emotion and reason in the human brain, when in fact neuroscience now shows quite clearly they are all part of the same circuitry and they work together. So perhaps the active imagination is to seek for new facts through using the scientific method and through finding a new evidence base for something that you didn't realize existed before. But my question is about how to make that work in practice, particularly in university research. And from your experience of many years of working particularly in interdisciplinary projects and environments, the Robert Schuman Center, for example, at the EUI, it seems to be quite difficult to make disciplines really work together because they often speak different languages to one another and they're often looking for different kinds of evidence, which then it's very hard to weigh up. They tend to produce apples and oranges and they feel more comfortable sticking with their apples and their oranges rather than trying to bring it together in a fruit salad. So what would be your advice to future funders of university research to make interdisciplinary work really function? For example, to understand decision-making at a very profound level, to bring together the neuroscientists and the psychologists and the anthropologists and the sociologists as well as the lawyers and the political scientists. How would you really do this? Now you have an opportunity to reflect on your whole career.
Thanks, Heather. That will take slightly more than half a minute, I'm afraid. We have little time. Thanks. The lady here, and then we'll pass the floor to the professor.
Hello, my name is Mary Caldor from the London School of Economics. Well, first of all, thank you. I thought it was a truly wonderful lecture, so thank you very much for the lecture. And I suppose I would love to sort of get into a discussion along the lines that Heather has just presented about facts and which conceptual frameworks, but that's not what I want to ask you about. It's thinking about this issue of post-truth and lies and what is it that troubles us. And I do feel there is something in populism that, and maybe the problem is not post-truth, but post-reason. You know, what really troubled me about Brexit was not just the lies, but the fact that the lies were utterly irrelevant to people's voting intentions. Likewise with Trump. I mean, you look at Trump's record and all the things that Trump has done in his life, which are so much worse than Hillary Clinton and her emails, and it didn't matter. And when we look now at the Brexit campaign, what we're hearing again and again from our government is the people have spoken, therefore there's no space for deliberation. So should we maybe be saying post-public reason rather than post-truth?
Thank you very much. I think there's a lot of food for thought. I would just add one comment very briefly, and that is, obviously, I mean, the answer to what is happening cannot be to cater to populism in a sort of, and saying lying is fine, not ignorance is strength, and all of this kind of thing. But at the same time, I think the so-called elite, which we are supposed to be part of, has to ask itself questions on how they communicate down to the people and with the people. And that creates this emotional rejection and thing. I think that's I'm very sorry, you seem to disagree, Giga, but I include the communication in Brussels. I'm sorry, many speeches from the Commission or Parliament or in the Council, if you read them, then you say, that's not the way to talk and explain things. I'm sorry, we have a real effort. We try to replace this by half-baked ideas about transparency, which is a voyeurism. Real communication, we should really think about how we talk, but sorry, it's for you, Professor, to answer all the other questions.
Right. So here's a legal dilemma. On the one hand, the program says we end at 11:30, and there's a fundamental human right to coffee.
Yes.
On the other hand, the program also said that this session will be 1 hour and not 45 minutes. So how would you want me to resolve that, Mr. Cloos?
I think I'll give in to your request for 10 more minutes if Anthony agrees.
I am as craving to coffee as I live on...
it's mostly bad coffee anyway, so let's take a quarter of an hour more.
It's one of my rational choices, nicotine and caffeine. The one thing, the questions, I would be mortified if people left this room thinking Joseph Weiler came here and he's anti-scientific and he doesn't believe in facts and rational thinking and rationality. But I think at least the way I presented was reasonably rational and thoughtful and reasonable. So please don't go away with that impression. And to one of the questions, it's not just recognizing that irrationality is hardwired to people, so we just have to take this into account when we design policy, when we understand our societies and the human condition, but that there are territories of the human condition which it's not a fault that they are irrational. Because as I said, generosity is not to be explained or applauded because of its rationality, although it could be on occasion rational. If we think in terms of virtues, resurrect, I don't know, Aristotle, Aquinas, Maimonides, which is a really anti-utilitarian view of what the good life should be, then a lot of the questions of what is the behavior of the virtuous person do not, some of them, the virtuous person is rational, but the virtuous person is not only rational. They are just whole areas. And one of the things we try to do in the universities is also to explore those areas. So yes, they are rooted in a reality, as you said. They're rooted in the reality of our lives and how we want our lives lived, etc. But it's a different approach, a different way of reasoning, etc. To argue, is it, let's take the most classical dilemma when Caiaphas says about Jesus, better that one man should die than the whole nation perish. What's the position that you take on that? If the life of the whole, let's say he was right. That's what he genuinely believed, that Jesus was a threat to the whole nation. Would you execute or not execute? Is it better that one man should die rather than the whole nation perish? Is it better to torture one guy in order to save maybe more others? Now, these are issues rooted in reality. Somebody was nailed to the cross, but the way we discuss them is not an evidence-based approach in the way we discuss whether we should have 2% tax or whether we should have a financial transaction tax, etc. And that is a huge important of the world of the mind for which the universities are custodians. I also want to say why I focused on doctorates. It's not the déformation professionnelle, because I ended up a few weeks ago, 9 weeks ago, 10 weeks ago, presiding over a wonderful institution which has as its mission to train doctoral students. It's the biggest doctoral school in social sciences in Europe, the European University Institute, because of the multiplying effects. 70% of the graduates of the European University Institute end up as university teachers. It's to them we entrust, and Europe is moving more and more, that's a positive thing, to broadening the social base of people who go to universities. So that's the importance of training doctorates and what we do in doctoral programs, because it's into the hands of these men and women that we entrust the people who don't do a doctorate to come and get a university education and then go out into life. So I wanted to make that point clear. The university are not blameless, and believe me that political correctness is one of the more minor defects.
You don't reassure me there.
Pardon?
You don't reassure me if that's one of the minor problems.
No, because do you know of any institution that is perfect and has not got major defects?
No,
I don't live in that world.
Apart from the Council General Secretariat, no, I don't.
That's right. That's right. Parliament is a wonderful, wonderful institution, but strangely, less and less people vote for it. How do we explain that paradox? Like Brecht, the people have disappointed, let's change the people. I want to say something about interdisciplinarity in reply to Heather. So it's very hard, as you say, to actually have a truly interdisciplinary research. And I think more successful and a more promising path is to have economic research, but informed by a political, legal, and humanistic sensibility. To have legal research which is informed by very sharp economic awareness and political awareness, so that the lawyer should not ask himself or herself only, so what is the law, what's the correct interpretation, but be informed in this interpretation what impact that ruling will have on the social condition, the economic condition, which is legitimate from a legal point of view, because teleological interpretation is in fact the prevailing mood of hermeneutics in law. To have a political scientist who can read regression tables, of course, but can also read a legal text, a decision of the European Court of Justice, and it does not appear to him or her as Chinese, etc. So I think those types of research are going to be more successful, more promising, more persuasive, better informed than the classical ideal of interdisciplinary research. But to achieve that, I'm sorry, I repeated ad nauseum and ad tedium, we have to look at how we train our university researchers. So there we're back to the doctorates. If the way we train our doctorates, and believe me, when I'm in the United States, I'm as critical there as I am here. But in the United States, you don't even start your dissertation before 2 or 3 years of deep preliminary studies where you cover broad disciplines and specialize them at above master's level, before you even define the topic of your dissertation. So I'm not advocating that we adopt the American model of doing a doctorate in social science and humanities, this profound, broad disciplinary specialization. Sounds a contradiction, but it's not, where academic literacy counts as much as the dissertation. But I do think that we are too much to the other extreme, and that also in the way we educate our future university teachers and researchers will almost in and of itself bring about a more interdisciplinary consciousness when people are doing their disciplinary work. And now really we have to assert the right to coffee.
We have to stop. Thank you very much, Professor. Just one thing which you said we could prolong for very many hours. Was very interesting was what you said about the moral dilemma. Sometimes you sacrifice one person to save the country. This, of course, is something which people in governments face every time. And the problem is that in the modern media world, you have one photo of someone who died or someone who's killed, and that dominates the debate. And yet the governments have to take a decision, for instance, on the protection of borders. I just give this small example. But let me conclude by saying that we will not accuse you of being an irrational man. I think you have extremely rationally demonstrated that human nature is made in such a way that the irrational and the emotional part of it are very important as well, apart from evidence-based research and all the other things. So thank you very much, and maybe we can do this in more detail some other time. Thank you.